Hello. Today we're going to talk about how to understand key ideas and details, specifically when looking at informational text. So first let's start with the differences between informational text and other types of text. Really, if you can just understand that what we mean by informational text is it's not literature, it's not fiction, it's all the other stuff that we look at to glean information. Things like a journal, a dictionary, even an editorial or a table of contents, a map. These are all things that we look to just to obtain information. So it might look like things like this. Here we have a graphic image of the plot of Romeo and Juliet to help us kind of walk through the major plot points or who the characters are. We might go to the internet and look up something about Shakespeare's life because we want to glean that information. Maybe we consult a map to see exactly where Stratford-upon-Avon is, which is the city where Shakespeare was born. And don't forget, we can also always look at a book. Those still exist, and they're often great sources of information. Here's a graph, a chart, that helps, a pie chart that helps us to see the causes of death in Shakespeare plays that somebody has researched, and you can see he was quite fond of a stabbing. But you know, he was creative as well, so we have at least one instance of someone being baked into a pie, potentially more. And so this is what informational text looks like. I'm not reading it for entertainment. I'm strictly reading it to obtain information. Here's another example. And what I want you to see here is just the differences visually that you see between something like narrative fiction, like a drama, the way it looks on the page, versus how it looks when I'm looking at informational text. So often writers try to help us out. They'll boldface questions. They'll italicize things. These even have hyperlinks. They'll include pictures and images and charts that help us get a full picture. Timelines, like you see at the top of this one, that help us to see important points and dates in Shakespeare's life. So informational text looks different on the page. And really, if you can learn how to use those things to help you understand informational text, it's very possible sometimes you just need to skim and find what you need, or you can get an answer to a question just by allowing that text to work for you. Here's some other types of informational text. You can see there's a whole bunch that fall into this category of informational text. Letters, interviews, government documents, memoirs, news articles, all fall into the category of informational text. So here's something else to consider. Does it have to be in print, or can informational text take a different form? So just as in print form, films can either be informational or they can be for entertainment or fictional. So we're going to stop and watch a quick video about William Shakespeare. This is an example of informational text in the form of a documentary from biography.com. So we're going to take a moment to watch this and see what informational text looks like in film form. Okay, now we're going to take a moment and we're going to watch a trailer for the film version, the latest film version of Romeo and Juliet. And you're going to see a very big difference between a documentary film and one that is fictional and made for entertainment. So just as you have differences in text, I want you to see that we can have similar differences when we look at other versions of informational text like film. So take a moment and consider the differences between a documentary film and a movie. So often in school, or as you're taking standardized tests, you are asked to read a piece of informational text and analyze it or think critically about it. Those really mean the same thing. When I ask you to think critically about a piece of informational text, or I say analyze the text, it means that you're looking at it very closely. You're not skimming, you're not reading for entertainment necessarily, and you're actually looking at it in a critical manner. You want to think about how the information is presented and the way that that might affect my understanding or thinking. I might also consider, how's it put together on the page? Does this affect what I think is important or what I don't think is important? I might also consider the author's opinions and viewpoints. maybe they're not obvious, but they're probably there. What the author thinks about the topic. If it is an argument and the author's making a claim, something that's debatable, I can ask myself things like, is this valid? Is it sound? Is it unsound or illogical based upon the evidence the author's providing? There's a lot of tools and strategies that can help you learn how to be a better reader and read more critically and closely. And I'm sure these are things that your teachers are using with you in your class. Notice that a lot of times it doesn't change whether I'm reading fiction or informational text. Okay, I still want to think about what's the author's purpose, what's the message, or if it's an argument, what's the claim. I'm still going to look at the way the writing is organized and structured, whether I'm looking at informational text or fiction. I still might look up words. Maybe one single word becomes critical to the meaning of the entire text. That can be true in both informational text or in fiction. Maybe I stop and I paraphrase or summarize. That can help tremendously when I'm trying to remember something or synthesize meaning. Okay. So take a look at these questions and you'll see that a lot of times the strategies don't change that much between informational text or fiction. Here's an example of what annotating text looks like. So this is something that a lot of people do when they're trying to do a very close reading. They're actually interacting with the text and writing on it and highlighting and circling unknown words or putting a star by things that are important or interesting. You know, methodologies can vary, but the outcome is often the same. This will help you to really pay attention to what you're reading, and in all likelihood you'll have a much better understanding at the end of it. So here you can see annotations on a piece of informational text, and here's what they might look like on Romeo and Juliet, and you can see somebody is very much interacting with the language here so that they can glean a better understanding. Let's talk about some key terms that accompany this idea of informational text. I like for students to delineate between a topic and a main idea or central idea and key point. So a topic is just simply, what is the text about? Don't make it too hard. And sometimes it's a broad topic and sometimes it's much more narrow. But how to get to the next concept, the main idea or central idea, or maybe it will say a key point, is I have to think about what point is the author trying to make about the topic. So it's actually like a step further from the broad topic usually. And this is how you can work to get to the main idea or central idea. So let's take a look at this piece of informational text. So I'm going to use the headings and the subheadings to really help me. I don't even have to read to know that the topic of this piece is Shakespeare, because that's the title. And so William Shakespeare and studying Shakespeare is my topic. And if I go further, I can see very quickly that really probably the main idea or key point of this piece is to look at why Shakespeare is still influential and popular. Okay, and I see the reasons, part of that subheading there. And then I can see that this one starts with number 1. Here are the reasons why you study Shakespeare. So topic is Shakespeare, and why we study it, the main idea or key point is the author's going to give us the specific reasons, and then we could break those down further. All right, a couple of other terms that are good to know when studying this concept, and that would be explicit evidence and implied evidence. So when I'm looking at informational text, I might need to differentiate between this is explicit evidence, but this is implied. Explicit means I can point directly to it. I'm not drawing conclusions, I'm not guessing, I'm not making inferences. I have been told something explicitly by the author. Okay, it's readily observable, it's laid out right in front of me. Implied evidence means I may have to make inferences or educated guesses. I can't always point directly to it in the text, but I get the message because of things like the author's tone or attitude or suggestions. This doesn't mean that I can't support my inferences with the text itself, but what it does mean is I may have to piece together logically phrases or words or bits and pieces of the writing in order to support my view that this is a logical guess or inference. Okay, so that's a big difference, and a good thing to understand is that most writing, most informational text will have a little bit of both of these. Okay, so let's look at an example. Let's go back to the piece we looked at before. Why study Shakespeare? The reasons behind Shakespeare's influence and popularity. This is informational text, okay? And let's say the question is, what does the author say about Shakespeare's popularity? So let's look at the very first paragraph. Ben Jonson anticipated Shakespeare's dazzling future when he declared he was not of an age but for all time in the preface to the first folio. While most people know that Shakespeare is in fact the most popular dramatist and poet the Western world has ever produced, students new to his work often wonder why this is so. The following are the top 4 reasons why Shakespeare has stood the test of time. So if the question was, what does the author say about Shakespeare's popularity? This is an explicit reference. This is explicit evidence to answer this question, because there it is right there. He's the most popular dramatist and poet the Western world has ever produced. Now, we haven't looked at the supporting evidence just yet, but to answer this question, this is an explicit statement that I can point to in the text. Now, let's say the next question was this: what is the author's opinion of Shakespeare's writing just based on what I see in these 2 paragraphs? Okay, now nowhere is the author saying, I think Shakespeare is wonderful. I think Shakespeare is the greatest writer of all time. But in fact, the author really is saying something like that. But I have to piece it together. I have to make inferences with what we call implicit evidence. It's implied, but it's not explicit. It's not directly stated. So I go back and I see phrases like dazzling future. I see things like, in the second paragraph, Shakespeare's ability to summarize the range of human emotions in simple yet profoundly eloquent verse. Those are very positive phrases, right? And it implies that the author admires Shakespeare and his writing. So that's what implicit evidence looks like versus explicit evidence. And it's important to see that both of those things are working in an informational text at the same time. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a partner activity, and you're going to read the short article entitled William Shakespeare's Relevance in Today's Society is Changing by Douglas Brewster. And you can mark on this. Feel free to annotate, mark the paper as needed. Also, as part of that, you're going to read a sonnet by Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote 150 sonnets and 37 plays, and this is one of them. And it's referenced in the article, so it's good that you can see the full sonnet here as well. After you read, you're going to work with your partner to answer 10 questions related to this text. Okay, you're welcome to annotate the text as you locate your answers. In fact, I would strongly encourage that, so that you're highlighting, underlining, making notes as you work to answer the questions. What we'll do then is we'll stop and we're going to review your answers together as a class and see how you did. Okay, good luck. All right, so we're going to take some time and review your answers. So let's see how you did working with your partner to answer some questions about informational text. If you need to make corrections, please do so. This is a learning exercise, and this is not about getting them all right. If you mess something up or you miss something or you want to add to your answer, feel free to do so. Okay, this is practice for this skill. All right, the first question you had is, what's the topic of this article? So if you just look at the title, you don't need to go any further. You know that this article is going to be about William Shakespeare, and if you want to go further, you could say William Shakespeare's relevance in today's society. Okay, and stop there, because that's the topic of the article. Now, if I want to go to number 2 and say, okay, what's the main idea or key point of the article? You really can also still use the title, except now you have to add that last bit of the title. So you have to say, look, the key point is the author's going to talk about the fact that Shakespeare's relevance in today's society is changing. And if we needed to go further, we could say that The author tells us that he thinks Shakespeare's reputation and legendary status is in jeopardy. He thinks it's going to change in the next 50 years or so, or at least the next 100 years, and that Shakespeare will not be as relevant as he is today. Okay, that's the main idea or key point of the article, and I can support that explicitly with the text right here, or the title. All right, let's look at question number 3. Douglas Brewster, the author of the article, admires Shakespeare's writing ability. Which words and phrases, or sometimes we call that rhetoric, okay, in paragraph 2 support this inference? So I can't point to this explicitly, but I can put some things together that help me support that kind of a statement. So if I look at paragraph 2, I can look at phrases like, the writings are legendary. This is an idiom, but to say that his talent is almost criminal. It's so good, right? And so exceptional. So that's an idiomatic expression, but it means that he's very, very talented. And this one is definitely more explicit. English had never sounded so good and has rarely sounded that way since. I could definitely support the statement that Brewster admires Shakespeare's writing ability just by looking at those particular phrases. All right, let's look at question number 4. Brewster says that, quote, the past 4 centuries have been good to Shakespeare, end quote. What evidence does Brewster offer to support this claim? So what you can see here is I've identified 4 pieces of evidence or support that he uses to support that particular statement, that the past 4 centuries have been good to Shakespeare. So 2 things going on here. If your teacher or the test were to ask you to point directly to the text, you could do that with this piece as well. So everywhere where you see I have it underlined, this is something you could directly identify from the text as support for this statement. School children can no more avoid his plays than a trip to the dentist. But look to the left here. What if you were asked to summarize the 4 pieces of evidence? So what you see to the left here in the boxes are summarized versions of the direct pieces from the text, the explicit evidence from the text. So in other words, what he means here is that Shakespeare's required reading in school. Most people are going to have to read some bit of Shakespeare at some point, especially in their public schooling. The second one, Shakespeare's playhouses have been reconstructed around the world. In other words, Shakespeare's plays are still being performed, and often they're performed true to the period, or this is what he means here by complementary settings. He says that, look, there's no shortage to read Shakespeare. It's pretty much free on the internet, and furthermore, it's in audio version, it's in Kindle version. You can get it on your smartphone or a tablet. You can read it, you can watch it, you can listen. It's your choice. In other words, Shakespeare is readily available. It's not out of print. It's not hard to find Shakespeare. And finally, he says he's still a star of the movies. So Shakespeare's plays are often made into movies, or it's a parody of the original play. In addition, we have Shakespeare himself being the subject of many movies and documentaries. So all of these things serve as evidence for the question in number 4. All right, question 5. Why does Brewster include the reference to Shakespeare's Sonnet 55? Well, Sonnet 55 addresses the idea of relevance and change. And this is absolutely why the author would include to reference this particular sonnet. Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets and 37 plays, so it's good that you're looking at one here. But notice how these 3 things work together. So we have the title, we have the sonnet itself, which talks about how time affects everything except, according to Shakespeare, poetry. When he says, you live in this is the poem itself. And for the most part, he's correct, right? It's over 450 years old, and we can still read it. And then we have the text from the article itself. So right here where I have highlighted in red, the author says what he did imagine was time changing everything. Now, this is where it connects to the author's key point, which is that he believes that Shakespeare is correct, and that eventually it will even affect Shakespeare's writing. So these 3 things work together to actually answer question number 5. Okay, question 6 says, take a look back at paragraph 3 and paragraph 9, and what is it that Brewster means when he says words get harder every year, or that the words somehow get harder? How's that even possible for words to get harder? And so we can point directly to the text for our answer here. Basically what he's saying is, look, language changes. If it's a living language, it evolves and changes in time. And it just means that because we no longer use a lot of the words that might have been popular in Shakespeare's time, the English becomes more difficult. It's harder. You have to think more about the different meanings for words or how it might have been used at the time, or you have to look at footnotes in order to grasp and understand the full meaning of the text. He also makes a really strong implication here that part of the reason we have trouble with the language is that we're such a visual culture, and Shakespeare's culture was much more about listening and hearing. People used to say that they would go to the theater not to see a show but to hear a show, and they loved the wordplay and the language, and that's how they got their entertainment. Our culture is much more attuned to visual imagery, and so it makes reading Shakespeare much more difficult for us. All right, let's look at question 7. What does the author believe will eventually happen to Shakespeare? Well, he pretty much tells us that he believes eventually, if you go directly to paragraph 11, this is explicit evidence. He says he will eventually be a brilliant author who can only be read by a few. Just like this guy over here, Geoffrey Chaucer, who is famous for writing the Canterbury Tales. This is in Middle English. This happened well before Shakespeare. All right, question 8. If we had to fill in the blank here, I think Brewster would imply, or definitely strongly implies, that technology is the thing that is most directly impacting Shakespeare's relevance in today's society. We have to kind of piece this together, because he doesn't come out and say this statement, but he does make lots of references to electronic conveniences. He says Shakespeare's the most anti-digital of our authors, and he says, look, it's hard to read Shakespeare. It's complex. It's rich in language. You have to be very literate, and you have to be able to sit down and concentrate and in quiet, which are not things that are really part of our modern age or the computer age. All right, number 9, what does the author hope will happen to Shakespeare's writing, and how do we know? He hopes that Shakespeare will actually not diminish in his relevancy, even though that's his prediction. So, and that's because he tells us here that may his writings live to see his 500th birthday. All right, last question is, I had you contemplate how could we change the title? What if we were talking about this title in Shakespeare's time? We might say that Shakespeare's relevance during the Renaissance was vital. What if we were talking about in the 1900s, William Shakespeare's relevance was perhaps diminishing? But what do we think the author might say about Shakespeare's relevance in the 21st century in another 50 to 100 years? He regrettably says, right, that the relevance might be obsolete. Shakespeare might become obsolete. All right, how did you do? Were you able to use both explicit and implicit evidence to answer the questions? Do you see how those two things function simultaneously to help us understand text and also understand the author's message or viewpoints? Were you able to recognize how the author organized his information and supported it with both explicit information and opinions? And it's important to have that skill. Now we're going to try to practice this on your own, and so you're going to read and annotate a short article called Shakespeare Our Contemporary, and it takes it's still centering around the same issue but takes a slightly different view. And then you're going to answer 5 corresponding questions when you're finished, and see how you do on your own with the skill of analyzing closely informational text. All right, thank you.